All right, welcome back. This is the start of chapter 18, which is a continuation of art that is about faith and specifically Islam. We're going to move pretty quickly through these because it's more about how the ideas of a religion spawn certain new visuals within the art world. And specifically when looking at Islam, when looking at the rise of Islam, it's emerging before even Rome falls, but it has this continuation with it. So we have what happens is that as the Roman Empire gets weaker, we have the Islamic Empire, which starts to rise and take over the Middle East, into the East, the north of Africa, work its way across all the way to Morocco, then up into Spain, where it'll eventually stop. But what's really interesting about it is that really around 622, the prophet known as Muhammad is sort of the instigator of this, and it's kind of interesting. He actually comes from a merchant family where trading. He's into the caravans and such, and he's fairly well off. And what really sort of happens in this is that he, as the story goes, receives a message from the angel Gabriel, giving him sort of these words, not that we now know as the Quran, but he's actually from that inception. He's actually run out of his hometown of Mecca and has to flee to Medina, and Medina being sort of a smaller city, but in that, he and his followers sort of kicked out. So it's this idea that it wasn't just accepted right off the bat. And then what's interesting is that just within it's either about 5 to 7 years, he returns back to Mecca with an army over 10,000 and takes over Mecca, and that's really starts the beginning of sort of the rise of the Islamic Empire. It spreads very quickly, and from there we get a lot of new sort of designs. Now, architecture-wise, when we were looking at Christianity, they used the sort of buildings that were around, which was those Roman basilicas. But for Islam, they sort of had to reinvent a new idea, and the basis of it was actually Muhammad's home there in Medina. And so we had to have a structure, basically like a square structure, a low roof structure, that has a courtyard area that was lined with palm trees, and that's where followers would come and gather to hear him speak. And so they used a lot of his home to then create what is now known as sort of the basic plan of a mosque, right? So we have the mihrab, which is the niche in the wall, and we're going to look at that here. And that's where he would have, what is sometimes said that he would have ceremonially, when Muhammad would speak, he would speak on that wall in that sort of niche. Kind of like in Christianity, we have sort of that altar space, but that's what this is. The Qibla is the wall actually faces Mecca, and as we all know, with the sort of prayers that happen 5 times a day, and the pillars of Islam that require that prayer 5 times a day, that direction of Mecca is very important. And then the minarets, which are the towers or tower that would be symbolic. They were actually originally watchtowers, because as you can imagine, kind of thinking of like sort of the invasion and sort of the conflicts when tribally they were still going on, but these minarets would also be what are known as the crier towers, or where the imam would go to the top and sort of shout out the prayers for that time. So these terms you'll need to know for the test. But here's that first major mosque structure. But based off the house, so what you would see here would be sort of that rectangular house portion, and what is now arches would have actually been at Muhammad's home a line of palm trees, right? Something to shade. So here's that same idea. We have the minaret, which is just one on this particular instance. And then back here is that niche in that wall that would face towards Mecca. So all mosques are based off of this plan. They all stylistically kind of change from culture to culture. One idea of that is here when we're looking at another one in Iran, and how they use these little tiny niches to sort of create what almost looks like a stalactite sort of look. And what all these images are coming from is that in Islamic religion, it is not proper, and it's really forbidden to create images of either human and animal form, things that really God has created. They are not supposed to sort of indulge in. So what we see is a lot of geometry, this pure mathematics, and with that, it's almost pure floral designs. The idea is that with the decorations is to create sort of like a Garden of Eden sort of look, right? This idea of paradise, and we can have this ceremonial paradise on earth within the mosque before you have paradise in the afterlife. So we see this again and again, but you will not see in decorations in mosques any images of priests, prophets. You will not have any of those sort of decorations. You're going to have pure geometry done on these tiles that sort of are done to an elaborate extent with the geometry that's used. Tessellations are used a lot in this, and you will also see what's called Giri tiles, which are these basic 5 shapes that can be put together in any way. So it's really beautiful, and of course as more mosques are being built, as the empire expands and of course becomes more wealthy, the more lavishness goes into them. Now the main form of art, the biggest form, if you had to call it the highest form in Islam, is calligraphy. And I want you to watch a film on Canopy called The Hidden Art of Islam. And this talks about how that calligraphy is about from words from the Quran, which is technically to them words from God, and so that would be the most beautiful thing, is God's word being spoken. And so you see this wonderful calligraphy, and sometimes you even see it done in sort of like animal gestures. It's not actually an animal, but it's the words themselves kind of silhouette and make one, and which seems to be kind of contradictory. And even if we looked on the image on the right, you're saying, well, I thought you couldn't have any human depiction. Yes. So what they found is that you couldn't depict an actual human being, but you could depict sometimes a stylized human being. And here, why we see a distortion in the space and distortion of the figure is because now you're not trying to create like quote unquote God would create man, right? You are creating it in sort of a cartoonish way. And this is how some sects of Islam sort of skirted around the issue of making images like this. Now we still see a lot of that floral design all the way around, a lot of the geometry, but having those images in there are still some that would say that this isn't correct, this isn't right, but others say, well, it's not like these are real human beings, so therefore it's fine. So we see a little bit of that. But just so you know that manuscript illumination and calligraphy are the highest forms of art in Islam. Now, as we move a little bit farther west out of the Middle East, we see some of these works in Africa that are very stunning. And we have something like this, which is terracotta or clay. And really, when we think of art out of Africa, we think of Egyptian art, right? That's sort of the main purpose. But throughout all of Africa, there's a lot of art that some has been preserved, some has been found in pieces, some has been written about, and these pieces specifically coming out of are survived because of being these terracotta figures. Now, what we notice about them is they're highly stylized. We don't really know what they would have been used for, primarily because as language, as tradition get passed down, that these things have been lost. Some of the earlier cultures that are down, well, they're just north of South Africa and stuff. We find large settlements, but have just sort of gone away. Um, there's not anything, there's no form of writing left with them. So similar to Paleolithic art, we're kind of kept guessing. But we see the style that we would synonymously say, oh, well, that's African art, and we still see that within the work today, how they almost geometrically, angular eyes, that sort of thing, lots of textures, emphasis on textures. But this is just the head, so we sometimes wonder, was the rest made out of wood? And if it wasn't, that's why we see sort of that deterioration over time, is that we're not dealing with permanent materials, mostly. But we do get some really interesting things that live on through the tradition, specifically a chief here. We know he's a chief because of the stool, sort of throne that he sits on, and of course, what's under his feet there. And what you're seeing is this veiling of the face, and this idea that you're not supposed to look upon on the chief's face, for he is sort of the embodiment of not only his ancestors, but it could be a god. So we see that veiling of the face, highly decorated and ornate. There is up top some bird-like figures. We see a lot of birds then that are also on the smock and the dress that's coming down, and all of these things sort of we would consider sort of a body adornment level within the art that tells us sort of what it's used for. Like, their art is very utilitarian, right? It serves a function. It's not just there to be beautiful, but it serves that everyday life and everyday function. These are pretty interesting, and the YouTube link is really great for explaining them. But these Nkandi figures that come from the Congo area are pretty interesting for the reason that they are created to sort of house a spiritual being. And if you look specifically on the one on the right, it's full of nails and shrapnel and things like that. And a lot of times these Nkandi figures would be driven in there as not as so much like as a voodoo to hurt things, but more to like keep the sort of the spirit at bay, right? Like, this is to sort of encapsulate a spirit, and sometimes they're evil and sometimes they're positive. So these are pretty predominant throughout the region, as far as sort of these like totems that house a sort of a spiritual message or a spiritual being. So they're not things that are meant to be destroyed, or now we Westerners, they collect them and put them in museums, but they would have once again housed a utilitarian purpose. So they're not interested in actual facial proportions. They're just interested in sort of that human likeness, and then the items that go on there are random and speak more to what is being offered to this god. As we like I said, we're going to move pretty quickly, and Asia is also one that we have a lot to cover, and so we will probably save this. I'm going to save this for the next part, and we'll jump into Asia and we'll get into some other films.